This time you can watch me drive while I talk instead of watching my face. I want to talk about archetypes today because I've learned a lot of cool things about archetypes recently. Just by thinking about archetypes, I've come to a bunch of realizations. So archetypes are symbols that we've inherited from our ancestors, and they're so permanent in our environment that they have become somehow encoded in our DNA, and then they get transmitted intergenerationally. They're pretty cool. But there's a contradiction when it comes to archetypes. How can they be inherited when the visual cortex doesn't make its neuronal connections until it experiences things and it gets older and older? Because if you put a certain filter over a cat's eyes, the scientists did this, and it only allows them to see horizontal lines, horizontal edges, so it's just horizontal slits. And then you take them off when they're older, they can't see vertical objects, so they bump into them. It's pretty sad, but very important knowledge was gained by that. All the connections in our visual cortex are created through the data and reinforcement of our experience. So it's pretty crazy. So if archetypes are inherited, are they really inherited? Because you can't even see the simplest things in your environment without experience. So how on earth are you going to inherit these concepts from your ancestors? Because they are inherited. A monkey who is in captivity, who has never seen a snake ever, if you put a snake, like a fake snake, in the room with them, they'll freak out. So obviously there's something going on with pre-built symbols or concepts that animals have from their ancestors' experience. It's kind of crazy. But where does that come from? Well, the first thing to realize is that there are some direct connections from your retinas to different parts of your body. I don't know, maybe it makes a pit stop at the hypothalamus. I don't remember. But there are pathways that don't go through your occipital lobe, and so it can bypass the entire route of conscious understanding before you get to respond to something. So there are a lot of examples of those. If they show you a black and white image with some animals inside of trees, you'll be able to spot the animals. Or if they flash it to you for only 30 milliseconds, something like that, you'll be able to say whether it had an animal or not, when it takes like 5 or 10 times longer for other objects. So it's pretty fast. Like, there are a lot of things that are hardwired into us so that they get like superhighways that are prioritized so that we can react, because they've been identified as extremely important over the generations. So we know that there are archetypes that are inherited, and they tend to be pretty rich. There's a lot of data in them. Like, the reason why you like movies and stories and fiction and stuff is because there is an element within. Okay, my windshield's fogging up. There is an element within them. Oh, shoot. That touches on the archetypes that you have inside of you. And so it immediately is important. You see that it's important. That's the theory anyway. And but archetypes are very rich. So how do they get that way when you don't have that much DNA to encode all of it. Like, you have 100 billion neurons, and I think around like 10 trillion connections between them. The data is really in the connections. And so you've got 10 trillion pieces of data in your brain. You cannot have, like, the vast majority of that is not determined by DNA. It's not passed down through DNA. And so I had this contradiction that you're inheriting these things, you know you're inheriting them, but how do you store this much data, and where do you store it exactly? And if it really is just direct pathways from your retina, why is there so much visual information? Why are they accessible to our consciousness anyway? And it's particularly interesting to me as an INTJ, and INFJs should also be interested in this, because my dominant psychological function, what I like to spend most of my time doing, is perceiving my unconscious mind, where all these archetypes live. There are so many archetypes. It's like a zoo. It's like a jungle of all kinds of archetypes. And so how does our conscious mind get access to these? Because we know we have access to some of them. Some of them come pretty easily. And here's my theory. When you're born, you've got some actions pre-built into you. Like, a cat is born to do cat things. They're baked into it, like chase mice, chase anything small that moves, poof up when they're scared. It's got a ton of cat things built into it, and babies do as well. They have to eat. That's like the first thing they have to do. And the way that is baked in is in systems of motion. So you've got a lot of muscles, and you get signals from your brain that tell your muscles to act in certain ways. And usually it's a pretty complex coordination effort. Like, you have a lot of muscles involved in even the simplest actions. You can move your arm up. You can move your tongue. You can do very simple, specific actions. But then there are categories of actions that all belong together as a response to something in the environment. For example, if you hear a loud noise, what you're going to do is you're going to duck your head, put your hands above your head, and bend your knees a little bit, and duck and kind of turn to look and see what's behind you, right? So, something like that. All of those are connected. That is instinctual. Those are inherited. That system is inherited. Not only the individual mechanisms that cause each muscle to contract, but every single combination that is important and instinctual. That's inherited. Okay? And archetypes are basically the centers of those combinations. I realize that archetypes are really close to the output of your brain. The output being the signals that go to your muscles. So archetypes, and that makes sense. What your DNA controls isn't all the fuzzy stuff that's learned through daily experience. That's all the middle of your brain, that, you know, the connections between the middle layers. It's the important stuff, the really permanent stuff, inputs and outputs of your brain. Those are strongly influenced by your genes. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because that's how it started. You have movement as a life form, and it's only one step extra complexity to add a node or a neuron one layer before the output that can connect to multiple outputs at the same time. That's very easy to arrive at from just the simple single output at a time model. So it makes sense that the things you inherit are close to the edges of your brain. And it makes sense because the most important things are things that require action. And the most important things also don't always give you the opportunity to learn about them before they happen. So the snake with the monkey, that monkey can't afford to not know what a snake is. It has to know what a snake is, and the one time it doesn't know could be fatal. So, but everyday data is cheap. When you're looking around, like, there's just massive amounts of data just rushing into your eyes and your ears and your just all your senses. Massive amounts. And the primary thing you do is filtering it out. So that stuff is not inherited because it's readily available to learn. Also, the local conditions of your environment can change, and that's the entire point of your learning algorithm that your neurons have, is to adapt to different environments so that you can predict different outcomes. So right. So, but what happens is the baby, it has some actions pre-built into it, and it's got some very primitive basic signals that are also hard-coded, so that it's almost a direct input-output response. Like, you touch it, it closes its fingers. You touch the hand, it closes its fingers. It's just a basic response. It's hard-coded. But then the interesting stuff happens when you start to connect the archetypes to your conscious mind. So you have no idea what you're looking at when you're a baby. It's just fuzzy. And your body will kind of react automatically. You're like, what the heck? Like, you get surprised by your own body all the time. But when you look around, it's mostly static. It's mostly fuzzy because you haven't developed the connections in your brain that give meaning to any pixel in your environment. So you're not consciously aware of anything, basically. It's just static. And then you start to notice patterns. Every time you see a face, you start to feel good because you're eating. So you recognized, your neurons start to connect the face of your mother to the archetype of mother. Because your brain, it can when your neurons fire together at the same time, they're more likely to connect to each other. So, as you come across all these patterns of behavior, these archetypes that signal these patterns of behavior you're doing, you start to associate the visual data and the auditory data, all of it, with the archetypes. There may be many layers of neurons that have to be built up in order to make those final associations, but that's what's happening over time. And then those archetypes achieve conscious expression. they have bodies. It's like they're spirits before, and then you give them bodies. It's not literally like that because it's just one is just more abstract than the other. They're both abstract. Everything is an abstraction, but you concretize it. You give it more. You give it your own individual familiarity. The senses and data that you're familiar with. It's like a coat that you've been sewing or crocheting. I don't know how clothes work. Anyway, it's something you've been producing over time, and then you clothe the archetypes with the context that means something to you, like consciously, subjectively. So I think that's how archetypal inheritance works, or inheritance of archetypes. And it's really cool. I actually think that there is like an entire jungle of archetypes that we haven't had the opportunity to connect to yet. And that's why it's important to explore in your life and face truth out there, because you have aspects inside of you that you've inherited that are waiting to achieve consciousness and to be incorporated into a higher awareness of the whole. So it's pretty cool stuff. And the crazy thing about it is it's real and scientific, and like the more you learn about neuroscience, the more the big picture starts to come together with all this stuff. But the main realization is that archetypes are all about action. And actually everything in your brain is about action. Action is what gives thought meaning. There is no such thing as a word by itself. The word has a meaning. It's only really there. Like, who cares? Like, the words I'm saying are pronounced in a way you've probably never heard them pronounced before. Not identical. It's different data. But what's common between them, you think it exists because it's concrete for you, because it's familiar. But that's because it has a meaning to you personally. The reason it has meaning to you is because you know what to do about it. You know what it would mean if the situation came up where you had to act. So, for example, if someone were to tell me there's an accident up there, I know what the word accident means. I know what up there means. There's N. I know what that means. So, the purpose of that sentence is not to document in a disembodied way how the world exists in a meaningless way. It's to give you the ability to act. Now, that's a really basic example, but I think if something abstract, let's say electrons are both particles and waves. Let's say that. That seems like an abstract thing. You understand the meaning of it, but the meaning of it is it exists in the expression of your action. So what would you do because of that? Well, you hold it in memory because your brain can do that. But it means nothing until you know how it would come into play if you were to act on it. So a physicist, when they hear that and they're learning, and they know that if they predicted chemical reactions, like eventually that knowledge, that abstraction would eventually cause them to act in one way and not another. I mean, the most immediate way is if you're trying to write a paper and get glory of scientific glory, achieve some great scientific discoveries for your name. and you didn't know that electrons are particles and waves, you would have a hard time being successful in life, because you've chosen an area that requires you to know things like that. And so the meaning of it for you is, if you're going to write a paper about it, you have to recognize it. If you're going to do an experiment on it, you have to take it into account so that you can achieve the things you want to predict. That was a long example, but the ultimate meaning of everything is how you act. It is expressed in your action. So it's the same for everything, and archetypes included. Yep. Well, there is the video today. I think there's nothing really else to talk about. I wish I could have done a better job of explaining why action is so important with meaning and action. They're like synonymous almost. But yeah, maybe real quick I'll pause and think about it before I say my last words about it. Well, the main thing is, I don't think people understand this. I was listening to an AI podcast where two really smart guys were talking to each other about artificial intelligence, and they're engineers. They do this every day. And one of them said, so what is they're trying to make an argument, so they're like, what is the output of perception? And the guy's like, well, it's a model. And he's like, right. I'm like, no, oh my gosh, no. This is why we're having such a hard time. And you see this all the time in the AI community. A label is not an output. We get confused because humans have mostly the same brain. We all kind of have the same brain. And words are no more than connections between neurons. And so by saying a word, you can make someone else's neurons fire. It's like a connection that goes through a pressure wave through the air. But that's all it is, basically, is a connection. So you have a neuron that's sort of like a temporary output, but it's not a real output. I mean, what big deal? You moved your mouth, you made vibrations in the air. You did nothing to the world. The entire point of speech is so that you can activate neurons in other people's brains that then activate their motor neurons so that they actually make a difference in the world. So the meaning of words, it's a social thing. If you the importance you place on that, it depends on how much you think that you are different than other people. I think that most people have mostly the same brain and different experience, different data loaded into it, but the same architecture. And when you speak a word, you activate neurons in someone else's brain, and the ultimate expression of that meaning is in the action that they perform. So when someone trains a neural network to produce labels, it's almost arbitrary. Like, you're almost training the neural network to create random characters, but just consistently. As long as they're consistent, like your random characters, then you think that the neuron is smart, or that the AI is smart. But it's not. It doesn't know the meaning of the words. You see examples where people say, oh, this is the last thing the AI is missing. You need to teach the AI to understand that an elephant could not be, the sentence that says, oh, I put an elephant on my head. It needs to be able to interpret that, no, they did not it was obviously a stuffed animal. Okay? But you can't understand that without understanding the actual meaning of words. And the meaning of words is expressed in the actions. So you need an AI. In order to have the same understanding of the world that humans do, you need an AI that is trained on the same rewards that we get for acting. So if you put something heavy on your head, and you eventually learn that that's not a great thing, the heavier it gets, that understanding of what the word elephant means will come automatically. like what it means in the context, that the inference that you're not going to do that, put an elephant on your head, like you can't even, that's going to come automatically. So it's interesting, the struggles that like I'm so glad that so there are two main sources. Jordan Peterson is a big source if you want to understand abstraction and meaning. He has a book called Maps of Meaning. You should read that book. The other one is a textbook. It's actually pretty dry, most of it, but it has some gems inside of it that are just epic. It's called Abstraction in Artificial Intelligence and Complex Systems. It is pretty cool. It was written in like 2012, I think, so it's got a bunch of outdated stuff, but inside of it has some gems, because it seems like it's almost like I don't know how influential the book is. I think it's fairly important, but because it's the only one I could find on the topic. And especially if you love learning about different subjects, it goes through different subjects. It's really cool. But the gems in it seem like the new way of thinking about abstraction. I feel like they're coherent. They make way more sense than all the different terms people were using before, or the meanings they used for abstraction. And it makes the world make a lot more sense as well. So those are two main sources I recommend. But anyway, I'll have a lot more videos about abstraction. I actually just gave a talk or presentation that I could link to here if you're interested in it, about what abstraction, truth, and light are from spiritual senses. Like if you're Christian, the way truth and light are talked about in the Bible, there are technical definitions of those things, and it's really cool. So yep, I probably went on way longer than I was intending on, but I think I said a bunch of things that I think are important. So yeah, I hope when I listen to this, it is way more coherent than I think it is. But I don't have very high hopes. Oh well.